Good Shabbos, everybody. This week's Parsha portion is Tazria Metzora, which deals with plagues. And before I start, I'd just like to say that although you're getting this video a little late, Shabbos in Halifax at least does not start until the latest candlelighting is 7:53. I'm not sure if you're going to get this much before that time. Please don't listen to it on Shabbos. You can listen to it after Shabbos. Hopefully it has just as much meaning. So this week's portion, talking about plagues, is quite apropos to what we're living through now. And if you look at the news and you start reading about different rabbis making different statements, or even actually many Christians, a lot of people like to try to give a reason. Why would God bring a plague to the world? What's the reason? And everyone tries to tell us, well, it's because we did this wrong, we did that wrong, or because Mashiach is coming, or he's not coming. There's all types of approaches and trying to rationalize things which seem to be somewhat random and sort of almost a source of evil in the world that's spreading, just causing sickness and death and economic harm to everybody in the world. And we're not the only ones who like to try to give reasons. If you look back in the Talmud, the rabbis always tried to give reasons for why the first temple was destroyed and why the second temple was destroyed. And they also say in regard to tsaras, this plague of leprosy, as we'll call it, that it's also associated with a specific sin. And they say, and you don't find this in the Torah at all, but they say it's related to the speaking lashon hara, speaking evil or bad, spreading bad tidings about other people. There is a hint of it in the Torah, you could say, because Miriam, when she speaks ill with Aaron, her brother, about Moshe, she gets tzara, she gets leprosy, and she has to stay outside the camp. So they learn from that, they understand from that she's getting, because she spoke lashon hara, she spoke ill about Moshe, and therefore you see that tsaras comes from speaking lashon hara. It's not so clear necessarily, and what I would like to say is that it's easier to give reasons like that when we don't have tsaras. We don't know what tsaras is. Like I say, it's not really leprosy, and we don't know exactly what it is. So it's not something which we actually know about today, and it's not practiced. All of the laws found in this, most of the laws found in this portion, don't have any applicability today. So when we have that kind of situation, it's much easier to say a reason. Just like we talk about the temple being destroyed. Why? Because it's not us, it's not our grandparents, it's not even our great-great-great-grandparents. It's someone in the ancient past, and it's much easier to ascribe that, oh, they did this sin. If you tell it to people now, as you would say, when people try to give reasons for the Holocaust, no one is very happy with it because all reasons fall short, and you're also ascribing guilt to someone that my own great-grandfather or my own grandfather or my uncle or even a parent, that we have no reason to assume that they were so wicked that they deserve such a terrible punishment. So we all find it very difficult to accept the fact that people are trying to give reasons for something which is recent. And the truth is, there's no different except in degree to go back to the destruction of the temple. But what we could do is say, listen, we don't really know why these things happen. We don't understand how God works, and there's never going to be a good explanation for why it happened. But to ascribe a reason is to create something for us to focus on that we could do tshuva about, that we could repent, that we could look at ourselves and correct. So whether it's the temple, the first destruction, or the second temple, which they say is because of sinas chinam, unnecessary hatred, divisions amongst Jews, that's really a great lesson. Whether that's why it happened or not is besides the point. But let's learn something from it. Let's take something positive away from something so harmful and terrible in our lives. The same thing is with tsaras, with leprosy. And why do they pick on lashon hara, wicked, evil talk about others? So I said one reason is because it seems to be hinted at in the Torah. But I think it's very simple that what's the punishment for tsaras? You go chutz lamachana, you go outside of the camp. You're banished. You live away You live in isolation as we do right now. And it makes sense to say that what sin really causes a breakdown of society? It's Lashon Hara. It's speaking evil about your neighbor. It's spreading bad tidings. It's talking about other people. And you create these divisions because even if it's true or if it's not true, there's different laws about whether it's Lashon Hara or not, but it doesn't really matter. When you speak bad about somebody, what you're doing is you're creating a problem for that person to function in society. And when you do it on a larger level, you're creating large divisions in society. So whether you talk about an individual or you talk about a shul or a group of people, a community, you're just destroying our community, destroying the Jewish community. You could destroy the secular community. It doesn't matter. What you're doing is you're undermining the cohesiveness which should exist within a country, within a community, within a shul, within a city. And therefore, that's why you're banished. You say, you don't deserve to live with other people if you can't respect other people's, the value of other people's lives and their meaning and their function within society. So that's a lesson that we can learn. So that's one point that I want to point out about this week's portion. And I think it's appropriate for us. I think the lesson is obvious that we don't know why we have what we have. And I'm not at all ascribing any reason, but let us take it and learn whatever positive lessons we could have, whether it's how we treat somebody, our values, our family, what's really important to us. Those are the things that we can learn. We don't have to go into detail now. The other point that I want to focus on is the reaction when we have terrible things happen. And I'm going to have to go back to last week's portion. Last week's portion was the death, and I mentioned it last week, the death of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And in that section it says what happens is Moshe tells Aaron, when your sons died, B'krova HaKadosh, the reason God, he took them away because he took those that are dear to him and he sanctified his name with their death. And I'm not going to go into an explanation of that right now, but it says that what was Aaron's response? Aaron's response was Vayidom Aaron, he fell silent. And so his reaction to the tragic loss of his sons was silence. And this is something that disturbs me and many other people. It seems that they're saying, well, Aaron's great. He accepted whatever God threw at him, and he just went on his way. And there's a whole kind of laws that have to do with the high priest and the temple, whether they're supposed to have mourning or not. We'll leave that aside for a minute. But the whole idea of giving up one's emotions and not expressing your emotions or not having those emotions are very difficult. If anybody else lost a son, if anyone else lost someone close to him and they don't have any emotions, they don't cry, they don't react, then you look at them and you say, you're not a human being. So how is it that we celebrate and we give honor to Aaron for not reacting? I don't have necessarily the answer, but I want to tell you over part of the story that I heard this week on Yom HaShoah, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I was sent out on the email in the shul. Anyone should really see it, is the story that Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel, told over. And I won't do justice to his story. He told it over beautifully. It was extremely moving. I felt like I was living through it. And the short version of that story is that he was liberated from the concentration camps when he was 8 years old, and he ended up in France in a camp with many other boys from 8 to 21. And when the townspeople came who helped them and giving them their provisions that they needed to survive and to move on in life, the boys were very angry. And they didn't want to express any appreciation for people coming. And in general, when he tells the story, you'll see that they didn't have any emotions. They were completely cut off. And as Rabbi Lau says, when they saw their father, their mother, their brother, their sister die, they didn't cry. They didn't want to give the Nazis that feeling that we hurt you. They just were stoically accepting of their fate, and there was no emotions. And it wasn't like they cried later on. They didn't cry, he says, for years, and they didn't laugh either. They didn't have any emotions. And the boys were not reacting until one fellow got up who was also a survivor, and all he said is, "Holy children," and something like that, something to that effect. And he started crying. And he stopped. He only spoke a few words, but he started crying. And the boys who were there, it opened up their emotions. And every one of them started crying. And one fellow got up and talked about how they really appreciate this Jew who spoke, because he let them feel human once again. They weren't feeling human. They weren't feeling any emotions. They weren't able to cry. This was the first time they were able to cry. And as Rabbi Lau said it so beautifully, now that we're able to cry, we will also be able to laugh later on. Now we're able to have feelings. Now we feel we could live a normal life. And I suppose thinking about that story, which again I suggest you should listen to Rabbi Lau and how he tells it over, but it made me think about last week's portion. And the fact that Aaron, when faced with this tragic loss of his sons, didn't react. It sounds like sometimes that's why, maybe it's just a reflection of how human beings act. But there's actually an argument amongst the rabbinic commentators. Some commentaries say he didn't react, because it simply says in the Torah. The Ramban Nachmanides says that no, he was crying, and then when Moshe told him, and he sort of comforted him, then he controlled his emotions. So that makes me feel a little better about Aaron, that he had those emotions, but he felt now is not the time. Not because he didn't feel, not that he didn't care, not that he didn't, it didn't hurt him and tragically change his life. It's just that realizing that perhaps there's some important reason for him now to move on, to go on and do his work in the temple, and that God had sanctified the God's name by taking his sons, he was able to control those emotions. And it made me think about just generally how people mourn. And they always tell stories about great rabbis, because it says you're not supposed to mourn on Shabbos or Yom Tov. You're supposed to wait till afterwards. And that always bothered me also, because what does that mean? You can't cry on Shabbos. If somebody close to you dies, you're going to cry. You're going to have those feelings. And they tell stories about great rabbis. Their young child died on Shabbos, and he didn't cry until after Shabbos. And I'm not sure how to react to that, and what kind of a person is that doesn't react. But I think that makes sense to a certain degree, and we all have that. Many of you, sadly, have sat Shiva at one point or another, have mourned the loss of someone close to themselves. And I could say from my own experience. And I found myself during Shiva sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. It depends on the situation. It depends who's there in the room. It depends what your mindset is. The human psyche is very complicated. Sometimes it's turned on, sometimes it's turned off. And therefore, sometimes whether it's a Yom Tov, not necessarily because the Torah prescribes it, but it's a time, just think about it, where somebody's parent dies and their child is getting married that week or the next week. You turn off the negative emotions, the sadness, and you turn on the happiness. And then when the happiness ends, you might go back. So the idea that Nachmanides is saying, yes, he had these feelings, and then he controlled it. Or he didn't have those on a temporary basis. That is normal human reaction also. And perhaps that's what the Torah is telling us, that sometimes we feel bad even that we don't feel like we're crying all the time when we have somebody die, somebody pass away, someone's sick. But that's normal. And maybe the Torah is teaching us that's part of being a human being, is that sometimes emotions are there and sometimes they're not. It doesn't make you worse or better either way. And again, I wish I had the answer for how to deal with tragic events. Many people try, and many people think they have all the answers. I think the real answer is that we don't know. And our job is to act in the most human way we can and try to, as Rabbi Lau said beautifully, cry and come to the point where we're able to laugh at another time. Remember that life still goes on and that we'll hopefully live through this and live through better times. Good Shabbos.